All right, welcome in, everyone. We're diving deep today into this CNN politics article that just came out. It's all about how the Trump administration is kind of like supercharging their immigration enforcement.
Yeah.
And it looks like things are moving really, really quickly.
Definitely. It's really interesting to see how they're like bringing all these different agencies together, you know, to detain these undocumented immigrants that are already here in the U.S. I mean, we're seeing a level of like coordination and planning that's kind of beyond, you know, just beefing up the Border Patrol. You know, they're pulling in the military. They're using the DEA and the ATF.
It's like they're trying to cast this huge net, you know, and just using everything they can.
Exactly.
So do you think this is going to actually work? Or is it going to cause more problems?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? So on one hand, like, it seems pretty smart to just use the resources they already have from these different departments. Like, it's a way to just sort of like bypass, you know, that whole long process of trying to get new funding from Congress.
I mean,
but it could definitely like create a lot of friction, you know, between the different agencies.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, they're going to be competing for people, for money.
Resources, everything.
Exactly, yeah. So, you know.
Like robbing Peter to pay Paul, right?
Exactly, yeah. You get that like short-term boost in one place.
Right.
But then you got to think about like, what are the long-term consequences, you know?
Yeah, are you going to cripple...
Right, exactly, other agencies.
Yeah, and you got to think about like, what does this mean for the agencies themselves?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like pulling DEA agents and ATF agents away from their like main jobs to help with these immigration raids. Like, I mean, how's that going to affect their ability to, you know, go after drug trafficking or gun violence? Like, is that really a sustainable approach? You know, it's really hard to say right now.
It's too early to tell.
Yeah.
And it's not just about like the personnel either, right? They're also talking about like upping the detention capacity.
Yeah.
And they're looking at like everything. You know, they mentioned military bases and even Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah, Guantanamo Bay is, I mean, what do you think about that?
It's
got that whole history, right?
Oh, a long one.
Yeah. And so using it to like hold migrants could like bring up some serious issues about human rights and like, you know, the whole idea of indefinite detention, you know?
Especially because the article said they want to reserve it for like the worst of the worst.
Right.
Like, who even decides that?
Yeah, that's right.
It seems kind of subjective.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also just the question of, is this even practical? You know?
I mean, the plan is to expand the facility there.
Yeah.
But that's going to take weeks, and it might not even be enough space to hold the 30,000 people that Trump wants to put there.
Right. So it's not really solving the problem.
Right. Exactly.
What about like the local police and stuff?
Yeah.
They're trying to get them involved too, right?
Right. Yeah. So using local law enforcement to help with these immigration arrests.
Yeah.
Like, that's a whole other can of worms, you know? I mean, there was a Homeland Security memo that said it was necessary because of this, like, mass influx at the border.
Okay.
But they also said that it could really strain local resources.
Right.
You know?
And what about, like, community relations?
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
If the local cops are seen as, like, mainly focused on immigration.
Yeah.
Does that hurt the trust that they've built?
Right, exactly. And then there's, like, the opportunity cost, you know?
Yeah.
Like, if local resources are being diverted to immigration enforcement, what are they not doing? You know? Like, what about crime prevention, community outreach?
Right, traffic safety, whatever it is, right?
Right, exactly. There's only so much they can do.
Yeah, there's only so many hours in the day.
Exactly.
And then we've got to talk about the military, too.
Yeah.
So Trump declared a national emergency at the border. And that's basically, like, opened the door for them to use a lot of Pentagon resources.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, you know?
Yeah.
Using the military for civilian law enforcement?
It's a really big deal. You know, the article talked about how they're using military flights to transport migrants.
Okay.
They're using Buckley Space Force Base to process immigrants. And then there's the whole Guantanamo thing.
Right.
Like, it really seems like they're depending more and more on the military to help them enforce these immigration laws.
And what do you think? Are there long-term implications for that?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, does it set a bad precedent?
Yeah.
Could this lead to, like, even more, you know, like, militarization of law enforcement here in the U.S.?
It's a slippery slope, right?
Exactly.
And then the article also mentioned this guy, Stephen Miller, White House Deputy Chief of Staff. And he's basically saying that, like, ICE field offices need to make at least 75 arrests per day.
Yeah.
So it feels like...
It's like they're just going for numbers, you know?
Quantity over quality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if the agents are under pressure to meet these quotas, like, are they actually doing thorough investigations?
Right.
Are they making sure that everyone's getting due process?
Right. Are they cutting corners?
Yeah, are they cutting corners? Exactly.
Yeah, and then the article mentioned that Customs and Border Protection is getting pulled in to help ICE too.
Right.
So it really seems like they're feeling the pressure.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, these ICE operations are super complex, right?
Yeah, it's not just about, like, round people up on the street, you know? The article was talking about these, like, carefully planned raids that happen, like, before dawn.
Oh, wow.
And they often involve DEA and ATF agents, too.
Yeah.
And they're going after undocumented immigrants that they think are, like, threats to public safety or national security.
So it seems really resource intensive.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, as Tom Homan, he's the White House border czar, he says they need more money from Congress to make all of this actually work.
Oh, of course.
He says they need more resources for everything from detention beds to, like, just the day-to-day costs of running these operations.
So they're basically building this, like, massive enforcement machine.
Yeah.
But they don't even know if they have the money to run it.
Yeah, that seems to be the case.
Wow.
And it really makes you wonder if all of this is sustainable in the long run.
Okay, so just to recap, we talked about how they're mobilizing all these different agencies.
Yeah.
The potential for, like, infighting between them. This emphasis on just making arrests, using military resources, and then the fact that they might not even have the money to do any of it.
Right.
But what does this all mean for, like, the people who are actually affected by these policies? You know?
Right, yeah. I mean, that's the really important question, isn't it? Like, we can analyze all the logistics and the politics of it all, but at the end of the day, it's about the human impact, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what does this mean for immigrant communities?
Yeah.
What does it mean for families who are living in fear of being separated? Like, what does it mean for the overall climate of trust and safety in our society?
That's a really good point, you know?
Yeah.
The article doesn't really, like, delve into the human side of it, you know?
Right.
But we can't forget that we're talking about real people's lives here.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's really important to, like, explore those human stories.
Yeah.
And to think about the ethical side of these policies. Like, how do we balance the need for security with the need to treat everyone with dignity and respect?
That's a really important conversation to have. But before we jump into that, let's take a closer look at the legal side of things. Are there any potential legal challenges or concerns that come up because of these actions?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of legal issues that could come into play here.
Okay.
One thing that jumps out right away is this whole idea of using the military for civilian law enforcement, you know? Like, there are laws and regulations that are meant to prevent the militarization of domestic law enforcement.
Right.
And what the administration's doing could be challenged on those grounds.
So using the military to transport migrants.
Yeah.
To process them at military bases and to potentially detain them at Guantanamo.
Right.
That could raise some serious legal red flags.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And this whole decision about potentially putting migrants in Guantanamo, that's like a whole other legal mess.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, Guantanamo has a really unique legal status.
Right.
And so detaining migrants there could raise all sorts of questions about due process, whether they have access to lawyers, and whether it violates international law.
It sounds like a legal minefield.
It is, yeah. And then there's the potential for legal challenges to the administration's plan to get state and local law enforcement to help with immigration enforcement.
Right.
You know?
So what are the main, like, arguments against that?
Well, giving local cops the power to enforce immigration laws is a really controversial issue.
Okay.
People who are against it say that it blurs the lines between federal and local responsibilities.
Right.
And they're worried about the potential for profiling discrimination and violations of civil liberties.
So it's not just about, like, logistics and money.
Right.
It's also about...
It's about navigating a really complex legal landscape.
It seems like this ramp up in enforcement is just the beginning of a very long and complex process with potential legal challenges, ethical dilemmas, and human consequences that we really need to grapple with.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that, like, behind all the headlines and the policy debates, there are real people whose lives are being directly affected.
Right. by these decisions.
Exactly.
And on that note, I think this is a good place to pause for a second.
Okay.
We've unpacked the main parts of the Trump administration's enforcement strategy.
Yeah.
And we've touched on some of the legal and ethical considerations that need to be addressed.
Right.
But I think we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about.
We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive.
Okay.
But in the meantime, we encourage you to think critically about what we've talked about today.
Right.
To maybe seek out some different perspectives and to have some thoughtful conversations about this really complex issue of immigration in our country.
Exactly.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah. It's really important to think about the ripple effect of these policies.
Yeah.
Like cracking down on undocumented immigrants could actually make them less likely to report crimes or cooperate with the police.
That makes sense. If you're constantly worried about getting deported,
exactly,
you're probably not going to want to talk to the cops, even if you need help.
Right, exactly. And that lack of trust can make it harder to keep everyone safe.
Right. It's like it's not just a simple thing.
Yeah.
Enforce the law and everything will be fine.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
There's just so much nuance that gets lost in all the political talk about immigration.
Totally.
It's easy to get caught up in the sound bites.
Yeah.
But we can't forget that we're talking about real people's lives.
Yeah, lives that are way more complex than the labels we use.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that most undocumented immigrants aren't criminals.
Right.
They're people who are working, raising families, contributing to their communities.
They're our neighbors, our colleagues.
Exactly.
The people we see every day.
Yeah. And when we reduce them to just their immigration status, we're ignoring their humanity and their contributions.
So you mentioned earlier that focusing only on enforcement might not be the best solution in the long run.
Right.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. When we just focus on enforcement, we're only dealing with the symptoms, not the actual causes of migration.
Okay.
And those causes are usually pretty complicated and interconnected.
So what are some of the main drivers of migration?
Well, poverty's a big one.
Yeah.
A lot of people have to leave their homes just to find work.
Right.
They're looking for a better life for themselves and their families.
It's about survival.
Exactly. And then there's violence.
Yeah.
People are running from wars, persecution, gang violence.
Right.
Anything that makes their home country dangerous.
So it's not just about a better life.
Right.
It's about safety and security.
Exactly. And then increasingly we're seeing climate change becoming a major reason for migration.
Oh, wow.
As natural disasters become more frequent, more severe, as droughts and floods make it impossible to farm or to find clean water, people are being forced to leave their homes.
So climate change is creating a whole new category of migrants.
It is.
Climate refugees.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these factors are often all mixed together. Poverty makes people more vulnerable to violence.
Right.
And climate change can make existing conflicts and inequalities even worse. So people are forced to make really difficult choices.
So basically, if we just focus on enforcement and we don't acknowledge these bigger issues, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge those deeper wounds, those root causes, and we have to work towards solutions that address those as well.
Okay.
Sustainable development, conflict resolution, climate action.
So it's about understanding the complicated reasons why people migrate.
Exactly.
And finding solutions that address those reasons while also making sure our borders are secure.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance, a middle ground that's both humane and effective.
So how do we as individuals have these conversations in a productive and compassionate way?
I think education is key.
Okay.
We need to learn about how complex the immigration system is.
Right.
About the realities of life for undocumented immigrants.
Yeah.
And about the potential consequences of different policy choices.
So reading articles, listening to podcasts, talking to people with different viewpoints.
Absolutely.
That's all super important.
Yeah, and once we have a better understanding, we can start having meaningful conversations with our friends and families and our elected officials.
And we can advocate for policies that are both humane and effective.
Exactly.
Policies that treat everyone with dignity
while
also addressing legitimate concerns.
Exactly. We can speak out against harmful stereotypes and misinformation. We can be allies and advocates working to build bridges instead of walls.
Building bridges, I like that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some unintended consequences of the administration's focus on enforcement.
Right.
Are there any potential downsides that people might not be thinking about?
Yeah, one concern is that this focus on enforcement could actually make our communities less safe.
Oh, wow.
If undocumented immigrants are afraid to report crimes or talk to the police because they're worried about being deported, it could create a situation where criminals actually benefit.
So it's possible that cracking down on undocumented immigrants could lead to more crime.
It's definitely a possibility.
Wow.
We've seen cases where witnesses wouldn't come forward because they were afraid of their own immigration status being questioned.
Right.
And that can make it harder to investigate crimes and let criminals get away.
And we also have to think about the economic impact.
Right.
Undocumented immigrants play a big role in a lot of parts of our economy.
They do.
What happens if they're suddenly gone?
There's no doubt that deporting a lot of undocumented workers would have a huge impact on the economy.
Yeah.
Certain industries, like agriculture and construction, really rely on undocumented labor.
Right.
Getting rid of those workers could lead to labor shortages, higher costs, and problems with supply chains.
So this isn't just a humanitarian issue.
It's not.
It's an economic issue, too.
It's both.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that these issues are all connected. We can't talk about immigration enforcement without talking about the economic and social contributions of immigrants.
It seems like this enforcement-first approach is creating a lot of unintended consequences.
It is.
That could end up hurting our communities and our economy.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
And it shows why we need a more nuanced and comprehensive approach to immigration policy, one that considers all the factors involved and prioritizes solutions that are both humane and effective.
And I think it's important to take a moment to really acknowledge the human cost of these policies.
Absolutely.
We're talking about families being torn apart, children being traumatized.
Right.
Individuals living in constant fear.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the policy debates and the legal arguments.
Right.
But we can't forget that these policies have a real impact on real people.
We need to listen to their stories.
We do.
Empathize with their experiences. And let those voices shape our understanding of these issues.
Absolutely. We need to humanize this debate and approach it with compassion and understanding.
So if we were to move away from this enforcement-heavy approach, what would a more humane and effective immigration policy look like?
Well, first of all, we need to address the root causes of migration that we were just talking about. Investing in sustainable development in the countries people are coming from.
Right.
Working to resolve conflicts and promote peace, tackling the climate crisis. These are all crucial steps that could help reduce the pressure on people to leave their homes.
But those are all long-term solutions.
Right.
What about the millions of undocumented immigrants who are already here?
Yeah, that's where we need to talk about pathways to legalization.
Okay.
Creating a system that allows undocumented immigrants to come out of the shadows, to get right with the law, and to fully contribute to our society.
So something like a comprehensive immigration reform bill?
Yeah.
I mean, those have failed in Congress before.
It's true that comprehensive reform is politically difficult, but I think it's the most humane and practical solution in the long run.
Okay.
It would let us bring millions of people out of the shadows, boost our economy, and strengthen our communities.
It would also allow us to shift our focus away from enforcement.
Exactly.
And towards integration.
Instead of spending billions of dollars on deportations and detentions,
right,
we could invest that money in education, job training, and community integration programs.
Okay.
We could help undocumented immigrants become fully contributing members of our society.
That sounds like a much more positive and productive approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think it's an approach that's more in line with our values as a nation.
So we've talked about the challenges.
Yeah.
The unintended consequences and the potential solutions.
Right.
What are your final thoughts on all of this?
I think it's important to remember that this is a really complex issue.
Yeah.
With no easy answers.
Right.
There are valid concerns about border security, about the rule of law, and about the impact of undocumented immigration on our communities.
Right.
But we need to approach these issues with nuance, with compassion, and with a willingness to consider different viewpoints.
We need to move past the rhetoric and the fear-mongering.
We do.
And have a thoughtful and respectful dialogue about how to create a fair and just immigration system.
Exactly. We need to find solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah.
Solutions that uphold our values and reflect our shared humanity.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Into the Trump administration's immigration enforcement strategy.
Yeah.
We've explored the complexities, the challenges,
right,
the potential consequences,
yes,
and the human stories at the heart of this debate.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
And I hope it's given our listeners a deeper understanding of this complex issue.
But this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore.
Right.
So many more voices to hear, and so many more solutions to consider.
I completely agree this conversation is far from over.
And we invite you to continue it.
Yeah.
Talk to your friends, your family, your elected officials. Read articles, listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
And challenge yourself to see things from different perspectives.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay compassionate.
Well said.
Yeah.
That's a perfect note to end on.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to continue exploring the fascinating world of immigration policy.
Sounds good.
Until then, keep diving deep. We've talked about, like, the economic downsides, right, of deporting all these people, but what about, like, society in our culture, you know?
Right.
How would our communities change if millions of people were just, like, gone?
Well, it would have a huge impact, a really profound impact on, you know, the fabric of our society. I mean, undocumented immigrants are such a big part of American life.
Yeah, they are.
They're our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, our family members.
Yeah.
And they contribute so much beyond just the economy.
Yeah, they bring diversity, new ideas, culture.
Right, exactly.
They make things more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And removing them would leave a huge void, you know, in every part of our society, from our schools and churches to our restaurants and our art scene.
It's like ripping a thread out of a tapestry.
Yeah.
Like, it weakens the whole thing, right?
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't just about these abstract concepts like society or the economy.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people, real families, real lives that would be destroyed by this policy.
Yeah, we can't dehumanize this issue, right? We have to remember that there are faces and stories behind these numbers.
Yeah.
And recognize that we're all human.
Absolutely. When we use labels like illegal alien or undocumented immigrant, we forget about their dignity and their worth. We forget that they are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, people with dreams and aspirations, and the same basic human rights as everyone else.
We've talked a lot about, like, the negative stuff.
Yeah.
Are there any positives that we should consider?
Sure. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there are real concerns about border security and enforcing immigration laws. And the administration's focus on these issues has definitely resonated with people who feel like these concerns haven't been taken seriously in the past.
So even if people don't agree with how they're doing it, they at least feel like they're trying to do something about it.
Right. I think that's fair to say, and it's important to have a conversation that acknowledges both the concerns and the potential downsides of different approaches.
We need to find common ground, right?
Exactly.
Figure out what we agree on and work towards solutions that address everyone's concerns.
Exactly, and that requires us to listen to each other, to have respectful conversations, and to recognize how complicated this issue really is.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
Yeah.
We've gone pretty deep into this whole thing. The Trump administration's immigration enforcement strategy. We've talked about the complexities, the challenges, the potential consequences, and the human stories that are at the heart of this debate.
It's been a really interesting conversation.
It has.
And I hope it's given our listeners a better understanding of this really complex issue.
We encourage you to keep learning about these things, to have conversations with people, and to challenge your own assumptions.
Remember, there are real people's lives at stake. Let's approach this with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.